The Forgotten Grave. Ellie had never liked cemeteries. The silence, the cold, the way the air seemed to thicken with every step. It all unnerved her. But this time was different. She wasn't here for a funeral or to pay respects. She was here for a dare. It had started innocently enough, a night out with friends, a few drinks, and a conversation that spiraled into the macabre. The topic of haunted places came up, and soon everyone was sharing stories about eerie experiences and local legends. But when the old cemetery on the outskirts of town was mentioned, Ellie's heart sank. She had always avoided it, ever since she was a child. "Come on, Ellie," her friend Mark had teased. "I dare you to spend the night there. Just you and your camera. If you make it until morning, we'll call you the bravest of us all." Ellie wanted to refuse, but peer pressure and a stubborn desire to prove herself won out. And so she found herself standing at the rusted gates of the cemetery at midnight, her breath visible in the chilly air, and her camera in hand. The cemetery was old, much older than the town itself. The headstones were weathered, their inscriptions worn away by time. Some leaned precariously, as if on the verge of collapse. The trees, twisted and gnarled, cast long skeletal shadows across the uneven ground. Ellie hesitated at the entrance, the darkness beyond the gates pressing in like a living thing. She shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "It's just one night," she muttered to herself. "I can do this." She stepped through the gates, her footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness, echoing off the headstones. She took a deep breath and started walking, her camera ready to capture anything out of the ordinary. The deeper she went into the cemetery, the more uneasy she felt. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches creaking ominously in the wind. She paused every few steps, listening to the silence, her heart racing. It was as if the cemetery was holding its breath, waiting. After what felt like hours, Ellie reached the heart of the cemetery. There, in a small clearing, stood an ancient mausoleum. Its stone walls were covered in moss, and its iron door was slightly ajar, as if inviting her in. Ellie hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But she knew that if she left now, her friends would never let her live it down. With a shaky breath, she approached the mausoleum, her flashlight flickering as she shone it inside. The interior was small and cramped, with a single stone coffin resting in the center. The air was musty, thick with the scent of decay. Ellie's pulse quickened as she took a step inside, her footsteps echoing off the stone walls. She raised her camera, the flash illuminating the room for a split second before plunging it back into darkness. Just as she was about to leave, something caught her eye, a small, dark shape in the corner of the room. It was a wooden box covered in dust and cobwebs, as though it hadn't been touched in decades. Curiosity got the better of her, and she knelt down, brushing away the cobwebs to reveal the box's surface. It was an old, ornate chest with intricate carvings etched into the wood. The lock was broken, hanging loosely on its hinge. With trembling hands, Ellie opened the lid. Inside the chest was a bundle of yellowed papers, tied together with a faded red ribbon. Ellie frowned, carefully lifting the bundle out. The papers were fragile, the edges crumbling to dust as she unfolded them. The handwriting was neat but spidery, the ink faded with age. It was a diary. Ellie flipped through the pages, skimming over entries written in a language she didn't recognize. But as she reached the final page, something caught her eye. A drawing, crudely sketched in the margins. It was a figure, tall and thin, with elongated limbs and hollow, empty eyes. The sight of it sent a chill down her spine. Before she could examine it further, a sudden gust of wind slammed the mausoleum door shut with a deafening bang. Ellie jumped, dropping the diary as she spun around. Her flashlight flickered, the beam wavering as she tried to steady her shaking hands. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, her breath coming out in visible puffs. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the walls were closing in on her. Ellie's heart raced as she frantically searched for a way out, but the door wouldn't budge. Panic set in as she heard a faint scratching sound, like nails on stone. It was coming from the coffin in the center of the room. Ellie backed away, her eyes wide with terror as the scratching grew louder, more frantic. She watched in horror as the coffin lid began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing force. Something was trying to get out. "No, no, no," Ellie whispered, her back pressed against the cold stone wall. She tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. With a final, violent shove, the coffin lid flew open, crashing to the floor with a deafening thud. Ellie's flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. In the pitch-black silence, Ellie could hear something moving, something shuffling and dragging itself out of the coffin. She could feel its presence, the cold radiating off of it in waves. The scratching sound returned, this time louder, closer as if it were right beside her. Ellie fumbled for her camera, her fingers trembling as she tried to turn on the flash. The light flickered to life just in time to reveal a figure standing inches from her face. It was the same figure from the drawing, tall, thin, with elongated limbs and hollow, empty eyes. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. Ellie screamed, the sound echoing off the stone walls. The figure reached out, its bony fingers brushing against her cheek, ice-cold and clammy. In a blind panic, Ellie bolted for the door, slamming her body against it with all her strength. The door flew open, and she stumbled out into the night, the cold air biting at her skin. She didn't stop running until she reached the gates, her breath coming in ragged gasps. When she finally looked back, the cemetery was silent, the mausoleum standing dark and still in the distance. But Ellie knew she wasn't alone. She could feel it, the figure's eyes watching her, waiting. She never spoke of that night to anyone. Her friends, thinking she had chickened out, never brought up the dare again. But Ellie knew the truth. The figure was out there, waiting in the darkness, and it would never let her go. From that night on, Ellie avoided mirrors and reflective surfaces, terrified of what she might see staring back at her. She knew that the figure had marked her, that it would follow her wherever she went. She was never truly alone, and she would never be free. And as the years passed, Ellie slowly began to fade, her once vibrant spirit withering under the weight of the figure's presence. The whispers in the night grew louder, the shadows darker, until eventually Ellie disappeared without a trace. The old cemetery still stands at the edge of town, the mausoleum silent and foreboding. But if you listen closely on a cold, windy night, you might hear the faint sound of scratching, of nails on stone, as something waits in the darkness for its next victim.